In the shadow of World War II, deep within the Balkans, rose a place of unimaginable horror, Jasenovac. Between 1941 and 1945, under the Ustaše regime, tens of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma were imprisoned, tortured, and murdered in one of history's most brutal concentration camps, the Auschwitz of the Balkans. In the spring of 1941, as the thunder of German tanks rolled across Europe, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia stood at a crossroads of turmoil and division. The fragile state, created after the First World War from a patchwork of ethnic and religious groups, had long been strained by internal tensions. Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and Slovenes shared a country, but not always a vision. When Axis forces invaded in April 1941, Yugoslavia's collapse came with terrifying speed. Within days, the Royal Army disintegrated, the monarchy fled, and Hitler's forces carved the nation into occupation zones. Amid the ruins, the fascist Ustaše movement saw its moment to rise. The Ustaše, led by Ante Pavelić, had been formed in exile years earlier, a radical Croatian ultranationalist organization dedicated to creating an ethnically pure, independent Croatian state. Its ideology fused extreme nationalism with fanatical hatred of Serbs, Jews, and Roma, whom they considered enemies of the Croatian nation. Backed by Mussolini's Italy, and later embraced by Nazi Germany, the Ustaše had waited for chaos to open the door to power. That opportunity arrived in April 1941, when Hitler established the so-called Independent State of Croatia, the Nezavisna Država Hrvatska, or NDH, a puppet regime stretching across modern-day Croatia and much of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The new state was presented as a triumph of Croatian nationalism, but beneath the facade of independence lay the machinery of terror. Pavelić returned from exile to take control, greeted by German and Italian officers as the new leader, or Poglavnik. The Ustaše quickly organized themselves into paramilitary forces and secret police, drawing on radical youth groups and exiled militants. Their aim was not merely to govern, but to transform society through violence and fear. Within weeks of taking power, the Ustaše announced a racial policy modeled on Nazi Germany's Nuremberg laws. Jews were stripped of their rights, their businesses seized, and their movements restricted. Serbs, who formed a large portion of the population within the NDH, were declared enemies of the state. Pavelić's regime vowed to eliminate them through a brutal Formula 1/3 to be killed, 1/3 to be expelled, and 1/3 to be forcibly converted to Catholicism. Across towns and villages, the new government's edicts unleashed chaos. Ustaše units, armed and emboldened, swept through rural areas, rounding up entire Serbian communities, looting homes, and carrying out massacres in fields and churches. Roma families were seized and deported, their names erased from local records. Synagogues burned in Zagreb and Sarajevo, as the Jewish population was forced into ghettos and detention centers. The violence was spontaneous and systematic at once, driven by local zeal, sanctioned by the state, and reinforced by the occupying German forces who viewed the Ustaše as useful allies in their campaign against partisans and ethnic undesirables. In the first months of the NDH, numerous makeshift prisons appeared throughout Croatia and Bosnia. Old military barracks, schools, and warehouses were converted into detention centers. The Ustaše created a network of camps to contain and eliminate their perceived enemies. Among these early sites were the Danica camp near Koprivnica, and smaller facilities in Gospit, Pag, and Jadovno, grim precursors to what was to come. Prisoners were crammed into filthy, overcrowded spaces, deprived of food and water, and beaten without mercy. Executions were frequent, carried out with rifles, knives, or blunt instruments. The brutality was shocking even to German observers, some of whom reported to Berlin that the Ustaše's methods were so savage that they risked driving the Serb population into open revolt. By mid-1941, the Ustaše recognized that their growing number of prisoners required a more permanent solution. The local jails and improvised camps were overflowing, and the killing fields of Jadovno, though efficient in their deadly purpose, were limited by geography and capacity. The regime sought a central site, a vast complex that could serve as both detention camp and extermination center. It would be a place where political prisoners, Jews, Serbs, and Roma could be imprisoned, exploited for labor, and ultimately destroyed. Thus began the conception of Jasenovac. The location chosen lay along the Sava River, near the town of the same name in the flat, marshy plains of central Croatia. It was remote enough to conceal the horrors that would unfold, yet accessible by rail and river. Perfect for transporting prisoners from across the NDH. The site had once been home to a brick factory, whose long industrial buildings and furnaces provided the Ustaše with ready-made infrastructure. The surrounding landscape, prone to flooding and difficult to escape, offered natural barriers. In August 1941, the Ustaše authorities formally established the Jasenovac Concentration Camp complex. It would soon become the largest camp in the Balkans, a network of death stretching across several sub-camps, each designed for a specific purpose, from forced labor to execution. The first prisoners arrived under armed guard in late August. Many were Serbs captured during anti-insurgency sweeps in rural areas. Others were Jews and political dissidents accused of opposing the Ustaše state. They were forced to build the camp with their bare hands, erecting barbed wire fences, guard towers, and barracks from salvaged materials. The guards, mostly young Ustaše militants indoctrinated in racial hatred, treated them with immediate cruelty. Food was scarce, water often contaminated, and beatings constant. Disease spread rapidly through the muddy, unsanitary quarters, claiming lives even before the executions began in earnest. Within weeks, Jasenovac's operations expanded. What began as a single compound soon developed into a complex of camps spread along the Sava River, Jasenovac I, IFI, IV, and V, including the nearby women's camp at Stara Gradica. Each section had its function, one for forced labor, another for political prisoners, and others for mass killings. Prisoners were forced to work on construction projects, railway maintenance, leather workshops, and brick production, all under the pretense of serving the Croatian state. In reality, starvation and exhaustion were deliberate tools of extermination. The camp command was ruthless and arbitrary. Among its first commanders was Miroslav Filipovic, a former Franciscan friar turned Ustaše officer, whose fanaticism became legendary even among his peers. He was known to personally participate in killings, earning the nickname, the Devil of Jasenovac. Under his leadership, and that of others who followed, the camp became a theater of unrestrained brutality. Prisoners were murdered not only through systematic executions, but through daily acts of sadism, drowned in the river, beaten to death, or mutilated for the amusement of guards. In its early months, Jasenovac's operations drew from a grim efficiency inspired by the Nazi concentration camp system, yet it developed its own methods of terror. Unlike the industrialized gas chambers of Auschwitz, the Ustaše relied on manual killing. Knives, hammers, and agricultural tools turned into instruments of death. The lack of mechanization did not lessen the scale of killing, it made it more intimate, more personal, and more terrifying. Prisoners were forced to dig their own graves, their screams swallowed by the wide, empty plains and the flowing Sava River. Meanwhile, across the NDH, the Ustaše continued their campaign of ethnic cleansing. Orthodox churches were destroyed or converted, and Serbs were compelled to adopt Catholic names or flee. Entire villages were wiped out, their populations sent by train or truck to Jasenovac. The German and Italian occupying forces, though occasionally disturbed by the extremity of the violence, largely tolerated it as long as it served their strategic goals. Reports from German officers described Ustaše atrocities in chilling detail, yet Berlin saw Pavelić's regime as a useful buffer against communist resistance. The Vatican, while informed of the massacres, maintained cautious diplomatic silence, unwilling to jeopardize relations with the Catholic regime in Zagreb. By late 1941, Jasenovac had become the central node in the Ustaše's system of persecution. Trains began arriving regularly from Zagreb, Sarajevo, and Banja Luka, packed with prisoners, men, women, and children. Many were deceived with promises of relocation or labor assignments. Upon arrival, guards divided them into groups. Those deemed fit to work were sent into the labor sections, while the rest were marched to execution sites beyond the camp's perimeter. The killings were carried out with shocking speed and brutality, their victims dumped into pits or into the Sava, their identities erased. Conditions for those who survived the initial selection were scarcely better. Prisoners were forced to labor from dawn to dusk, often building or repairing the very facilities that imprisoned them. Hunger gnawed constantly. Rations consisted of a few ounces of moldy bread and watery soup. Disease, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, spread through the camp unchecked. Medical care was virtually non-existent, and those who fell ill were often executed as unfit to work. Every day brought new arrivals, and every night new deaths. The camp became a machine of annihilation, fueled by ideology and sustained by fear. Despite the secrecy surrounding the camp, rumors of its horrors spread quickly through occupied Yugoslavia. Survivors who escaped or were released told stories of mass executions, of priests and peasants killed alike, of entire families vanished without trace. Resistance movements, both communist partisans and royalist Chetniks, began to cite Jasenovac as a symbol of Ustaše cruelty and a rallying cry for rebellion. The NDH regime denied the reports, describing the camp as a labor and re-education center, but the truth could not be contained. By the end of 1941, Jasenovac had already claimed thousands of lives. As winter descended, the camp's brutality only deepened. Prisoners were forced to work in freezing temperatures without adequate clothing. Many collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies left where they fell. Guards carried out nightly executions, sometimes competing among themselves for the number of victims they could kill. In the absence of gas chambers or crematoria, the Ustaše often burned corpses in open pits or buried them in shallow graves along the riverbank. The Sava carried countless bodies downstream, a silent testimony to the scale of murder. The administrative machinery of the camp grew more organized as 1942 approached. Records were kept, names, numbers, confiscated possessions, though much would later be destroyed to conceal the evidence. The commandants reported directly to the Ustaše Interior Ministry, which oversaw the deportation and liquidation of undesirable elements. German officers occasionally inspected the camp, noting both its effectiveness and its chaos. Some found the Ustaše's methods primitive compared to German efficiency. Others saw in Jasenovac a horrifying experiment in unrestrained fanaticism. For Pavelit and his followers, the camp served both ideological and practical purposes. It was a weapon against the Serb population, a deterrent to rebellion, and a means to purify the nation in accordance with their racial vision. But it was also a system of labor exploitation, supplying forced workers to state-run industries and military projects. The brickworks at Jasenovac produced materials for construction across the NDH, built with the blood and sweat of those who would never see freedom again. The first months of Jasenovac's existence thus marked the transformation of Croatia's wartime landscape into one of terror and extermination. The camp stood as the culmination of the Ustaše's vision, a physical embodiment of their ideology of ethnic hatred. Behind its barbed wire, the boundaries between political prisoner and ethnic victim blurred, for all who entered shared the same fate. By the close of 1941, the outlines of a genocidal system were firmly in place. The machinery of death had begun to turn, slowly at first, but with a momentum that would soon claim tens of thousands. Outside the camp, the war intensified. The Axis occupation faced mounting resistance from partisans across Yugoslavia, led by Josip Broz Tito. The NDH struggled to maintain control over its vast territory as uprisings erupted in the Krajina, Lika, and Bosnia. Each rebellion brought new waves of arrests and deportations. swelling Jasenovac's population. Trains of prisoners moved in endless procession toward the camp's gates, while the Sava River carried their remains away in silence. What had begun as a political tool of repression was now an engine of genocide, its reach extending to every corner of the puppet state. By early 1942, Jasenovac had become fully operational, a place of systematic killing unmatched in the region. The camp's infrastructure expanded, its guard units increased, and its methods grew even more cruel. New subcamps were established for women and children, the youngest victims of the Ustaše racial campaign. The foundations had been laid for the years of horror to come. The name Jasenovac would soon become synonymous with death, a symbol of human cruelty that would stain the memory of the Balkans for generations. By the beginning of 1942, Jasenovac had become the beating heart of terror within the independent state of Croatia. The camp's perimeter stretched for miles across the flooded plains of the Sava River, its watchtowers rising over a landscape of mud, barbed wire, and human despair. What had begun months earlier as a site for forced labor and executions had now evolved into a complex network of death. Its commandants and guards refined their methods, extending the system into a series of subcamps connected by rail, road, and river. Each new expansion deepened the camp's role in the Ustaše's grand design of ethnic extermination. The year opened with waves of deportations from across the puppet state. Entire Serbian villages from Banija, Kordun, and Lika were emptied under orders of the Interior Ministry. Columns of men, women, and children were forced onto trains bound for Jasenovac, unaware of what awaited them. Jewish families from Zagreb, Osijek, and Sarajevo were rounded up and sent to the same destination, often under the pretext of relocation to labor centers. Roma communities, already devastated by disease and starvation, were hunted down in the countryside and delivered to the camp in open wagons. The flow of humanity toward Jasenovac seemed endless, and with each arrival the boundaries of the camp swelled to contain them. The administration of the camp fell under the Ustaše surveillance service, known as UNS, which operated with near total autonomy. Orders from Zagreb were brief, leaving commanders to execute policy with discretion. Among those who presided over this machinery of death were Lubo Milo and Dinko Erkit, both men in their 20s, both steeped in the ideology of racial purification. Their authority was absolute. Beneath them, hundreds of guards patrolled the fences and work sites, many drawn from local militias, others from Ustaše youth formations trained to obey without question. Under their watch, the camp took on the rhythm of organized slaughter. Prisoners were divided into categories according to their ethnicity, religion, and perceived usefulness. The strongest were sent to labor detachments. Carpenters, masons, tailors, and smiths forced to build the very infrastructure that sustained the camp. The weak, the sick, and the elderly were taken to nearby fields or riverbanks and killed. The executions were carried out daily, sometimes publicly as a warning, sometimes in secret during the night. Knives, clubs, and mallets replaced bullets, both to save ammunition and to prolong suffering. The Ustaše took pride in their work, keeping informal tallies of victims and boasting of their efficiency. The killing fields expanded outward from the camp's center, marked by mounds of disturbed earth that grew with every passing week. Among the most chilling developments of 1942 was the creation of the Starogrady camp, located a few kilometers from Jasenovac. Originally a fortress from the Habsburg era, it was transformed into a prison for women and children. Here, mothers and daughters were separated from fathers and sons, their identities reduced to numbers in a ledger. Guards subjected them to forced labor, starvation, and torture. Infants were torn from their parents, many dying from neglect or deliberate murder. Survivors would later recall the cries that echoed through the fortress walls at night, a haunting reminder of a cruelty without limit. While the killing continued inside the wire, the war beyond the camp raged on. In the mountains of Bosnia and Croatia, partisan resistance grew stronger. Tito's communist forces launched attacks on Ustaše outposts and railway lines, seeking to disrupt the Axis supply routes. The Ustaše responded with mass reprisals, rounding up suspected collaborators and sending them to Jasenovac. Each partisan assault brought retaliation not just against fighters, but against entire villages. German and Ustaše patrols worked together in anti-insurgency operations, the captured sent directly to the camp. As the front lines shifted, Jasenovac became a destination for anyone labeled disloyal, from captured rebels to ordinary peasants caught between the warring sides. Inside the camp, the rhythm of life and death settled into a grim routine. Prisoners rose before dawn, lined up for roll call, and marched to their work sites under the gaze of armed guards. Some were assigned to the brickworks, others to carpentry or metal workshops. A small number were selected for clerical duties, forced to record the names and belongings of the dead. Every task was performed under the threat of instant execution. Hunger gnawed constantly at the prisoners. Their daily ration consisted of a piece of bread and a cup of watery soup. Those who faltered from weakness were beaten or shot. Yet amid the misery, acts of humanity persisted. A crust of bread shared, a whispered prayer, a hand extended to help another rise. The Ustaše leadership often visited Jasenovac, treating it as both a symbol of power and a demonstration of loyalty to the Axis cause. Pavelit himself toured the site, accompanied by officials who praised its efficiency. German envoys were occasionally invited to observe, though their reports back to Berlin conveyed unease. Some officers described the camp as a place where bestial cruelty exceeds all imagination, yet no intervention came. The Germans viewed Jasenovac as an internal matter of the Croatian state, a local solution to local enemies. By mid-1942, mass executions had become an integral part of the camp's function. Prisoners were transported to killing sites by cart or on foot, their hands bound with wire. The largest of these sites lay near the Gradina fields across the river, where deep pits served as mass graves. Here, hundreds could be killed in a single day. The Ustaše devised macabre competitions, rewarding those who murdered the most victims. One of the most infamous contests took place in August 1942, when guards competed to kill prisoners using special knives known as sabosjek, Serb cutters. The slaughter lasted through the night. By morning, thousands lay dead, their bodies piled into open graves. Such events became whispered legend among survivors, proof of the boundless depths of the regime's brutality. Despite the omnipresent danger, small pockets of resistance formed within the camp. Prisoners smuggled messages to partisans outside, warning of mass killings and requesting aid. Some stole tools or forged weapons from the workshops, hiding them beneath floorboards. Escape was almost impossible, but not entirely. A few managed to flee across the river under cover of darkness, their stories spreading across the countryside. Their testimonies reached partisan commanders, confirming what many already suspected, that Jasenovac was not a prison, but a death factory. As 1943 began, the tide of the war began to shift. German defeats in North Africa and at Stalingrad weakened the Axis alliance, while partisan forces in Yugoslavia gained momentum. The NDH regime grew increasingly dependent on German military support, and Jasenovac continued to function as its instrument of terror. The camp's population fluctuated with each new offensive. After every battle, trains of prisoners arrived to fill the void left by the dead. Jews deported from Croatia and Bosnia were joined by captured partisans, Chetnik fighters, and civilians accused of aiding the resistance. Roma families continued to disappear from the countryside, their existence erased without record. In the midst of these upheavals, the camp administration made efforts to disguise its true purpose. Propaganda films were produced showing prisoners at work, smiling under the supervision of guards. Journalists from friendly Axis nations were invited to tour selected areas, carefully staged to present an image of order and rehabilitation. Behind this facade, the killings continued unabated. Night after night, groups of prisoners were taken beyond the fences, never to return. Their names vanished into the ledgers, replaced the next morning by new arrivals. The landscape of Jasenovac reflected the contradictions of its existence. Alongside the workshops and barracks stood gallows, execution pits, and pyres. Smoke rose constantly from burning corpses, mingling with the mist from the river. The air was heavy with the stench of death. Even among the Ustaše, morale began to waver. Some guards deserted their posts, fleeing to avoid the front lines. Others, intoxicated by power and ideology, became even more brutal. The camp was both their domain and their prison, a world governed by fear and absolute authority. In the autumn of 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies, and the balance of power in the Balkans shifted dramatically. German forces moved quickly to occupy former Italian zones, while the partisans seized vast territories. The NDH found itself besieged from all sides, its army stretched thin. Yet even as its political control weakened, Jasenovac remained operational. The Ustaše leadership, fearful of losing their grip, intensified the extermination program. Deportations increased once more, targeting anyone suspected of sympathy with the resistance. Political prisoners, intellectuals, clergy, and peasants alike were swept into the camps maw. Inside the wire, despair deepened. The winters of 1943 and 1944 were among the coldest on record, and the lack of food and clothing took a devastating toll. Frozen bodies lay unburied along the camp roads. Disease spread unchecked, claiming hundreds each month. Still, the killings continued. Women and children at Stara Gradiška were executed in groups, their bodies buried in hastily dug trenches. The guards, fearing advancing partisans, began to destroy evidence of their crimes, burning documents, dismantling facilities, and incinerating corpses. But the scale of their atrocities was impossible to conceal. The land itself bore witness, its soil saturated with blood. As 1944 unfolded, the war turned decisively against the Axis. Allied bombers struck targets across the Balkans, and Tito's partisans, now recognized by the Allies as the legitimate Yugoslav army, closed in on Zagreb. News of Germany's retreat spread rapidly, and panic gripped the Ustaše leadership. Orders were given to accelerate the liquidation of prisoners before the inevitable collapse. Inside Jasenovac, mass executions reached their peak. Thousands were murdered in the final months, their remains cast into the Sava or buried in unmarked graves. The camp became a scene of chaos. Guards burning records, prisoners collapsing from starvation, the constant echo of gunfire across the marshes. Amid this descent into destruction, whispers of rebellion began to circulate among the inmates. A group of prisoners, mostly skilled workers and clerks who had access to tools and keys, began to plan an uprising. They knew that liberation was near, but also that the Ustaše intended to kill every remaining prisoner before retreating. Secret meetings were held in the workshops, weapons were hidden beneath planks, and escape routes were mapped through the minefields and swamps. It was a desperate gamble, but it offered a final chance at life. On the morning of April 25, 1945, as German and Ustaše forces prepared to abandon the camp, the prisoners launched their revolt. Under a grey dawn, they stormed the fences, attacking guards with hammers, axes, and bare hands. Gunfire erupted across the compound. Hundreds fell under machine gun fire, but others broke through, running toward the river and the forests beyond. Of the approximately 600 who attempted escape, only a small number survived to reach partisan lines. Those who remained in the camp were executed in the hours that followed. Jasenovac, the largest concentration camp in the Balkans, was finally silent. When partisan units entered the area days later, they found only ruins. The Ustaše had set fire to the barracks, demolished the watchtowers, and destroyed as much evidence as possible. The riverbanks were littered with debris. Charred timbers, broken chains, fragments of human bone. The partisans uncovered mass graves stretching across the fields of Gradina, their size beyond comprehension. Reports from survivors confirmed what had long been suspected, that Jasenovac had claimed the lives of tens of thousands, men, women, and children from every corner of the region. In the months after the liberation, investigators began the grim task of exhuming graves and collecting testimonies. The full scale of the atrocities defied calculation. Estimates of the dead varied widely, from several tens of thousands to well over 100,000. Records had been destroyed, witnesses killed, and entire families erased from existence. Yet the evidence that remained spoke for itself. Mountains of shoes, personal belongings, and fragments of identity cards buried in the soil. The name Jasenovac became a synonym for annihilation, a scar on the history of the Balkans that would never fade. As the war in Europe ended and the new socialist Yugoslavia emerged, the ruins of Jasenovac stood as a monument to suffering and loss. Survivors returned to the site to mourn, to remember those who had vanished, and to rebuild what little remained of their lives. The camp's grounds were left as a silent witness, the river flowing past as it always had, carrying with it the memory of the countless souls who perished along its banks. In the years that followed, the story of Jasenovac became part of the collective memory of a nation torn by war and ideology. Monuments were erected, trials were held, and testimonies recorded. Yet no act of remembrance could erase the truth of what had occurred. Between 1941 and 1945, in the heart of the Balkans, the Ustaše regime had created a place where humanity itself was stripped away, where faith, ethnicity, and innocence were reasons for death. Jasenovac stood not only as a crime against its victims, but as a warning to the generations that followed. A reminder of how quickly hatred can become policy, and how easily policy can become extermination. The war that had given birth to the camp ended in flames and surrender, but the echoes of its cruelty endured. The river still runs past the fields of Gradina, through the lands where the cries of the murdered once filled the air. The soil still holds their remains, the silent testament of a nation's darkest years. And though decades have passed, the name Jasenovac remains a wound, one that history will never let the world forget. After the war ended in May 1945, the world stood in the shadow of devastation. Across Europe, Allied investigators uncovered the remnants of Nazi terror, the camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Dachau, and among them, in the heart of the Balkans, lay the ruins of Jasenovac. What remained of the site was little more than scorched earth, blackened timbers, and shallow pits filled with human bones. The Ustaše had done their best to erase their crimes before retreating, but the land itself refused to forget. The first Yugoslav partisans who entered the area described an eerie silence, broken only by the wind and the murmur of the Sava River. The stench of decay hung in the air, and beneath the churned soil, the evidence of mass murder waited to be unearthed. In the months following liberation, the new Yugoslav authorities launched an extensive investigation. Forensic teams, soldiers, and local villagers began to exhume the graves that stretched for miles along both banks of the river. The work was slow and harrowing. Many of the bodies had decomposed beyond recognition, while others bore marks of the violence they had endured. Skulls fractured by hammers, bones bound with wire, fragments of children's clothing clinging to the earth. Items recovered from the pits told stories that no words could convey: religious icons, school books, wedding rings, rosaries, and photographs of families who would never return. Witnesses who had survived the camp were brought to testify before local tribunals and war crimes commissions. Their accounts filled the gaps left by destroyed records. They described the layout of the camp, the routines of forced labor, and the systematic nature of the killings. Each testimony added another layer to the growing portrait of atrocity. The Yugoslav War Crimes Commission gathered hundreds of statements from survivors, villagers, and captured Ustaše members. Among them were guards who admitted to taking part in mass executions and commanders who claimed to have followed orders from above. The trials revealed not only the scale of the crimes but the deliberate intent behind them. A state policy of extermination that mirrored, in form and ideology, the genocidal practices of Nazi Germany. In late 1945 and 1946, as the Nuremberg trials proceeded in Germany, the new socialist Yugoslavia held its own proceedings against members of the Ustaše regime. Ante Pavelić, the leader of the Independent State of Croatia, managed to escape to Austria and later to Argentina, aided by elements of the Catholic clergy and sympathetic Western intelligence networks. Many of his closest associates fled with him. Others were captured by the partisans or handed over by Allied forces. Dinko Oakit, Iljubo Milov, and other Jasenovac commandants were among those tried for war crimes. Court records documented their brutality in chilling detail, recounting specific massacres, the use of torture, and the extermination of children. Some were executed, others disappeared into hiding. Pavelić himself evaded capture for over a decade, living under false identities until his death in Spain in 1959. In the aftermath of the trials, Jasenovac became both a physical and symbolic site of remembrance. The new Yugoslav government, led by Josip Broz Tito, declared it a place of national mourning. In the early post-war years, the ruins were left largely untouched. A scar preserved in its rawness. The surviving bricks of the old factory buildings, the rusted remnants of wire fences, and the sunken earth of the graves remained as silent witnesses. Pilgrimages began almost immediately. Families of victims traveled from Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia to search for traces of their loved ones. Many brought flowers or crosses, leaving them on the open fields where the graves lay exposed to the sky. As the 1950s progressed, the Yugoslav state embarked on an ambitious effort to document the atrocities of the war. Archives were opened, and commissions compiled data from across the republics. Jasenovac occupied a central place in this effort. Historians estimated that between 70 and 100,000 people had perished there. Serbs, Jews, Roma, and anti-fascist Croats among them. The exact number would remain a subject of debate, but the evidence of mass killing was undeniable. The site became a symbol of both national suffering and the unity of the peoples who had fought against fascism, under Tito's vision of brotherhood and unity. Jasenovac was to serve not as a wound dividing ethnic groups, but as a monument to collective resistance and the shared pain of all Yugoslav nations. In 1966, 2 decades after the war, a memorial park was established on the site. The Yugoslav architect Bogdan Bogdanović was commissioned to design a structure that would embody remembrance without reproducing the imagery of horror. The result was the Stone Flower, a vast concrete sculpture rising from the plain like a bloom emerging from the soil. Its petals, open to the sky, symbolized life and renewal after destruction. Around it, the fields were landscaped into wide green spaces, serene and empty, allowing the silence itself to speak. The opening ceremony drew crowds from across the Federation. Survivors, soldiers, and officials gathered beside the river to honor the dead. The Stone Flower became one of the most powerful memorials of post-war Yugoslavia, a fusion of art and grief set amid the flat expanse of the former killing ground. Over the following decades, Jasenovac assumed an important role in the Yugoslav narrative of anti-fascist struggle. School children were brought there on field trips. Delegations of workers and soldiers came to lay wreaths and attend commemorations on the annual Day of Remembrance. Museums were established near the site, displaying artifacts recovered from the excavations, personal belongings, camp tools, and fragments of documents. The stories of survivors were recorded on film and preserved in state archives. For many Yugoslav citizens, Jasenovac was not just a historical site, but a moral foundation, a reminder of the cost of division and hatred. Yet beneath the unity promoted by the socialist state, tensions lingered. The memory of Jasenovac, though enshrined as a symbol of shared suffering, carried within it the specific trauma of ethnic violence. Among Serbs, the camp was remembered primarily as the site of genocide against their people. Among Croats, many struggled to reconcile the crimes of the Ustaše with their own national identity. The state's official narrative sought to balance these memories, emphasizing collective victimhood over individual ethnic experience. This approach preserved stability, but it also silenced open discussion. For years, debate about the true number of victims or the full extent of Ustaše collaboration was discouraged, subordinated to the need for unity in a multi-ethnic federation. In the late 1980s, as Yugoslavia began to fracture under political and economic strain, the memory of Jasenovac resurfaced with new intensity. Nationalist movements across the republics invoked the camp's legacy to strengthen their own narratives. In Serbia, political leaders cited Jasenovac as proof of historical persecution, calling for renewed protection of the Serbian nation. In Croatia, some voices sought to minimize or reinterpret the crimes of the Ustaše, portraying them as exaggerated products of communist propaganda. The site that had once symbolized unity now became a battleground of memory, its history weaponized by opposing sides. When war returned to the Balkans in the 1990s, the region around Jasenovac once again became a front line. The memorial park was damaged during the fighting between Croatian forces and Serb rebels. Mines were laid across the surrounding fields, and the museum's collections were looted or destroyed. The stone flower, though scarred, survived. For years, access to the site was impossible, the area too dangerous to approach. Only after the Dayton Accords of 1995 brought peace to Bosnia and Croatia did efforts to restore the memorial begin. International organizations, historians, and local communities collaborated to rebuild the museum and clear the land of explosives. Slowly, Jasenovac emerged again as a place of remembrance, though the divisions of memory remained unresolved. In the post-war era, research into the camp's history expanded beyond Yugoslav archives. Scholars from Europe, Israel, and the United States examined the surviving documents, testimonies, and forensic evidence. Their work revealed new dimensions of the camp's operation. The administrative networks linking it to Nazi Germany, the cooperation between Ustaše and German security services, and the systematic nature of the deportations. The study of Jasenovac became part of the broader scholarship on genocide and the Holocaust in southeastern Europe. International conferences and exhibitions brought renewed attention to the camp, while survivor organizations continued to advocate for recognition of its victims on the global stage. At the turn of the 21st century, a new museum was built at the site, replacing the older structures damaged during the war. Its design emphasized simplicity and reflection along a dark corridor lined with glass cases displaying the personal objects of the victims: watches, letters, prayer books, shoes, and toys. Digital archives allowed visitors to search the names of those who had perished, connecting families with fragments of their lost histories. The memorial once again became a place of education, drawing visitors from across the world. Each year, on April 22, a commemoration is held to mark the anniversary of the prisoners' uprising in 1945. Survivors, diplomats, and citizens gather before the stone flower, laying wreaths in silence as the names of the dead are read aloud. The passage of time did not erase the debates that surrounded the memory of Jasenovac. Historians continued to argue over casualty figures, the responsibilities of individuals, and the role of the camp within the broader machinery of genocide. In independent Croatia and Serbia, interpretations often diverged along national lines. Yet despite the disagreements, the essential truth remained uncontested that between 1941 and 1945, under the rule of the Ustaše, tens of thousands of innocent men, women, and children were murdered because of their ethnicity, religion, or political beliefs. In the early decades of the new millennium, efforts to reconcile the divided memories of Jasenovac took on renewed importance. Joint commemorations were organized by Serbian and Croatian leaders, and religious representatives from Catholic, Orthodox, Jewish, and Islamic communities gathered to pray together at the site. Museums in Zagreb and Belgrade collaborated on shared exhibitions, presenting the camp's history within the wider European context of fascist terror. International institutions including Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum recognized Jasenovac as a key site of the Holocaust and genocide in southeastern Europe. At the same time, survivor testimonies continued to shape understanding of the camp's legacy. Many of those who had lived through Jasenovac were now elderly, their voices fragile but urgent. Their interviews and memoirs captured not only the brutality of their suffering, but the resilience that had allowed them to endure. They spoke of friends lost, of small acts of kindness amid horror, and of the responsibility to bear witness. For them, remembrance was not an academic exercise, but a moral obligation. As they passed away, their stories were preserved in recordings and written archives, ensuring that the human dimension of Jasenovac would never fade into abstraction. The physical landscape of the camp remains deceptively calm. Visitors walking through the memorial park today encounter wide open fields, reeds swaying along the Sova River, and the towering silhouette of the stone flower against the sky. There are no reconstructed barracks or barbed wire fences, only the quiet expanse of earth beneath which thousands lie buried. Along marked paths, plaques identify the locations of the former subcamps, Krapje Ciglana, Kozara, and Stara Gradica. Each represents a chapter in the story of destruction that once unfolded there. The museum's exhibitions invite reflection rather than spectacle, allowing the weight of silence to convey what words cannot. Forensic studies conducted in the 2000s and 2010s have continued to uncover remains and artifacts, confirming the scope of the mass graves and validating survivor accounts. Archaeological teams, using ground, penetrating radar and modern mapping techniques, have identified new burial sites across the Gradina plain on the Bosnian side of the river. These findings, combined with archival research, have reinforced the historical record against denial and distortion. Educational programs now bring students from across the Balkans to study the history of the camp, encouraging dialogue and understanding across ethnic lines. In the modern era, Jasenovac stands as more than a site of remembrance. It is a mirror reflecting the region's turbulent history. The camp's story encapsulates the extremes of human cruelty and the fragile hope of reconciliation. Each generation that visits confronts not only the legacy of the Ustaše, but the enduring question of how societies remember their darkest chapters. The fields that once echoed with screams are now silent, yet beneath the silence lies a message that transcends nations and centuries. From its creation in 1941 amid the collapse of Yugoslavia, through its years of operation under the Ustaše regime, to its destruction in 1945 and its resurrection as a memorial, the story of Jasenovac traces the arc of the 20th century's greatest tragedies. It reveals how ideology can transform ordinary men into executioners, how bureaucracies can become instruments of annihilation, and how the memory of suffering can endure long after the last witness is gone. The stone flower still stands above the plains, its concrete petals opening toward the sky, an enduring monument to those who perished and to those who survived to tell their story. As evening falls over the Sova, the memorial is bathed in the golden light of sunset. The river flows quietly past, carrying reflections of the sky across the waters that once concealed so many lives. The air is still, the fields motionless, the silence vast. In that silence lies the weight of history, the memory of tens of thousands whose voices were silenced, whose names remain inscribed in stone and in the conscience of humanity. Jasenovac endures not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of the cost of hatred, the necessity of remembrance, and the enduring hope that such darkness will never return.